I'm talking with Dan Holden, Director of ASERT, Arbor Networks. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me, as always.
Yeah, this is becoming a tradition, obviously.
I think
so. With, I think we're on 5 or 6.
It's got to be.
So let's keep doing it. Let's start out with the state of the industry. You've had a little more chance to see the RSA show floor this year and pick up on the vibe.
Yeah, I think we always try and pick what the theme is.
Yep.
I tweeted yesterday that the most overused word on the floor has got to be before. Detect before, stop before, everybody's saying before. I think there's been a couple words. I'm not seeing any particular theme or word like last year was just everything was threat intelligence.
Right.
And I think, half the startups we saw were all threat something.
Right.
This year, I think I'm seeing a couple things I like. A lot more focus on incident response, which, I'm a big proponent of. I think a lot of the chatter has been around the people problem in the industry, just the absolute shortage of people and how I think finally, the whole conference and our whole industry has always been so focused around technology, even though we preach process and people as a part of that. Mm-hmm. Really RSA is all about the technology. But I'm starting to see some things where you're starting to see words like efficiency and people and scale, used in a more, in a particular way as to scale, to scale your response to the attackers and that sort of thing. Time to response.
In
quite
the
a bit
same
of
vein, and on the more social side, there's a lot more attention this year than I've ever seen for women in cyber.
I was actually going to mention that. I would totally agree. And if you look at, I think, attracting the next generation into this industry, I think we absolutely have to go there. I mean, just fundamentally as a math problem, I think we've got to make it a more attractive industry to the new generation and specifically also to the female gender for sure.
Yeah.
It's, when I was coming up, as a young man in the 90s, everybody wanted to be a hacker, and we had hacker movies, like crazy, and that was a very attractive thing. And now, I don't know that it is so much. It's, it's all about mobile apps and games and, streaming on Twitch or having your own YouTube channel.
Right.
And so, being in an industry where a lot of what you do that is meaningful and, is rewarding is not necessarily seen,
mm-hmm.
or if it is, it's it ends up on your blog or at a talk, and it took you, maybe months to get to that point. So I think we've got to figure something out to be able to attract talent, and then also be able to scale the talent that we do have. That's a big one. So I think on-the-job training has become far more popular and needs to continue. And I think the tools and the technology. So from our responsibility, from the vendor front and the technologist front, I think we've got to start thinking about things like workflow, things like everybody talks about user experience, but it's not about having a slick, fancy thing. It doesn't have to be like your phone. What it needs to do is promote the process, I think, and also promote perhaps career growth as you go through that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going into a incident response team, at a junior level, how do you stay as a part of that incident response team and go through it, rather than essentially you get a bunch of on-the-job training and then you just leave, for a better paycheck somewhere, which I think is what a lot of the companies trying to hire incident response run into.
Sure.
It's hard to retain. It's hard enough to attract talent, and then it's really hard to retain talent as well.
Yeah, and based on the level of activity of recruiters on LinkedIn, now they're adding cyber to their titles as well. And that's getting out.
It is a good time to be in recruiting.
Yeah.
That is for sure.
Yeah. And a good time to have any sort of skills.
Yeah.
With a Z.
Yeah. It's been a while.
How about you? How do you hold people in ASERT? How do you encourage them to?
That's a good question, actually. And we've got very, very good retention. And a lot of that has to do, what I've always said with security research, and I think what anyone's, witnessed as security researchers or as a part of any organization, it's not necessarily, of course, paycheck's always important to everyone, but a lot of times it's what you're working on and who you're working with. And I think those are really, really core.
Sure.
So, at Arbor specifically, honestly, one of the things that attracted to me, and how I can attract talent is the data. So I think a lot of companies, especially smaller, as a startup, you're you're having to look at how you can utilize other data sources, right? So there's a lot of open source stuff that's utilized, and even if you look at the Packet Loop acquisition we did 2 years ago, you don't have all that data as a startup, so you have to look at ways to do data analytics and machine learning and all these fancy analytic types with data that already exists. Same thing with all the usage of honeypots and I think feedback mechanisms from products. So yes, you need to be creating your own data, but I think the more established companies are in a position where they've now been creating and doing data storage now for so long that, funny enough, you might look at Arbor Networks and say, oh, it's a network company that has been transforming over the years into a network security company. But at its core, what do I spend so much of my budget on? It's data storage. What do we end up producing from a content standpoint, from a talk standpoint? Our worldwide infrastructure security report, right? It's all representative of the data that we've been collecting and creating for so many years. The products, yes, they give you a view of the network. They show you what you should be caring about from a flow standpoint, a context standpoint, but what are they also doing? They're showing you, essentially the data as it pertains to the rest of the internet and how that's interacting with your network. So I think Arbor and many companies that have been around for some time now, you could almost argue that they are becoming data companies as much as they are, their core competencies and history.
For sure, data and data sharing companies, because all their clients benefit from all that data.
True, and you're right. I mean, you see a lot of vendors that have been talking, everybody's doing a press release, we're partnered with this vendor or that, and now it's almost a joke because then, an acquisition happens a few months later and the whole thing looks, completely ridiculous. But, I would almost argue the best data sharing that is not trust groups, which is probably the best data sharing, is potentially with your customer base, not necessarily even your partners or other vendors.
Right.
It is the customers, the enterprises, the ISPs, the hosters. I think, one of the big things I'm going to be talking about this year at RSA, I'm going to be drawing an analogy to Robert Moses, who was the master builder of New York. And he didn't just think of New York as the 5 boroughs. He also counted New Jersey, Connecticut, and the rest of New York State. And so he was looking at a bigger picture, and I think that's what everyone that is responsible for their portion of the internet has to be thinking about. If you just think about, my enterprise network, this banking company I work at or whatever, that's not just your network. You're also potentially hosting some of the botnet infrastructure on the internet. Certainly ISPs and hosters are. So I think you got to be looking at not only your network, but how it is interacting with the rest of the internet and your responsibility to the rest of the internet. And I think that's increasingly becoming more important because the decisions that a lot of these companies are having to make, cloud adoption, SSL, even what kind of policies they enforce internally and then are forced upon them, from a law standpoint or compliance standpoint. All those things potentially not only affect them, but maybe, their partners, their customers, and maybe, other parts of the internet potentially.
Let's turn back to Arbor and what's happened since the Packet Loop acquisition over 2 years ago.
So yeah, we just launched a new release called Arbor Spectrum, which is really taking the Packet Loop acquisition and that technology, big data analytics, which was really good from a hunting standpoint, so being very proactive about your incident response. We've put a big focus on incident response and on really the ability to show a host level view, not just network, but a host and how it's interacting with the rest of the network. So primary use case, of course, being very quick and efficient incident response, getting incident response down from, whether it's days or weeks in some cases, or days or hours, down to minutes. I think, we had a customer that they were just looking at the product and had a response within 7 minutes, and they were just doing a proof of concept. And that's the kind of not only story you want to hear, but I think that's where you've got to get to, within minutes. And of course, eventually as close to real time as you can, because certainly that's the level the attackers are at.
Right.
So definitely a focus on incident response, being able to see how a particular host might be interacting with the rest of the network, whether that's internal, external, but also horizontal, and essentially being able to prioritize and understand what your risk is. That way you can prioritize your people's time as as a part of your incident response process, which I think is very important. The whole point, of course, not to be wasting your time with false positives, which has really been the focus of the product over the last few years.
Thus your comments about the labor force.
Right.
Maximizing what you have.
Yeah. I think, there are so many indicators of compromise that I think the whole industry is just talking about there's noise, and you get alert fatigue. And that's why there's been so many solutions, whether technology or managed services or whatever the case might be. But if you're looking at a really mature incident response organization and process, I think you've got to be able to take all of that data and get it to a very usable point and place. And a lot of the technology to date, I think, has been very difficult to ask questions of. You can get something from it, but it generally takes a lot of effort to do so, and you can't just simply ask it a question. So I think just being able to get very simplistic, quick human read on a situation and be able to assess that risk and prioritize the people's time as a part of the process is very important, and that's been a focus of ours.
Cool. So what's next?
Well, going faster, getting that response time even better. I think, quite honestly, context. If you really want to be able to assess risk, and I say assess risk at any level, whether that's the analyst level or whether that's at a management level, right? If something bad is happening, how bad, and what is the risk to us, short term, long term, whatever the case might be. So I think increasing context is really key. So getting as much data about a particular incident, as much data about a particular aspect of the network or the host, filling in those blanks, the more and more is definitely helpful. And I don't mean that just from let's go lower level. I don't know that lower level actually is going to scale long term. That's exactly why you can't just sit there and look at, if you're looking at Wireshark all day, you're not responding very quickly.
Right.
If you're sitting there looking at memory dumps all day, you are not responding very quickly.
Or even sim logs.
Or exactly, sim logs, syslogs, all of the things that you can shove into a gigantic data set, you're not moving quick enough. And I think you've got to get the most critical data, the most important data, and very high fidelity data, again, so a human being can make an assessment quickly.
I see this as a stepping stone towards, and you mentioned, the attackers are getting faster and faster, so we have to get faster and faster, but the ultimate is automated attacks. As, we've seen one example, Stuxnet. That's the only example we can mention, we can think of.
Right.
But in the future, the attackers are going to know, hey, if it's all about racing you to the finish line, we're just going to pre-program it and go at machine speed.
Well, they've been winning the race for years, I mean, if you look at just the amazing horsepower behind a botnet of any size, right? I mean, so if you look at, some of the largest DDoS attacks, using reflection amplification, the botnets used to do that are actually quite small compared to, let's, say, 5-6 years ago, where the thinking was the bigger the botnet, the more power behind it. So I think the raw horsepower and their ability, I mean, they've got amazing business processes. We just did a write-up and a blog on how much money a Russian botnet service was making. And it may not look like a lot at face value because they're actually quite cheap, but it's like any other commodity level thing, right? It's not about how much you're charging, it's about how many times you charge it.
Right.
So it's easy to say, we've been losing to the attackers for a long time, but I think they've actually been leveraging technology in some cases far better than us for a long time. They have very good ways to measure their ROI. They are collecting data, from their products essentially, right, their botnet, incredibly well. So they know what they're doing and how well they're doing it. To some certain extent, I always remind people there's a certain aspect of your roadmap that you don't own. The threat landscape should own it.
Completely.
Yeah. And if you're not thinking that way, then you're going to lag behind.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.